This is Julie Pearson, Little Thunder. Today is September 21st, 2018, and I'm interviewing Dr. Carol Connor for the Oklahoma Oral History Research Program at Oklahoma State University. Dr. Connor, you're from Kingfisher, Oklahoma.
I am.
You attended school at OSU for your graduate work, and you have a consulting firm, Paradox, with your husband, Dr. Joe Connor, who also has a doctorate, and you both published the Fairfax Chief. We'll be covering a few highlights from your life, including your memories of OSU, but also how you manage your academic and newspaper work and how that all led you back to Fairfax. Thank you for taking the time to talk with me.
Sure.
Where were you born and where did you grow up?
So I was born in Enid, Oklahoma. Our town apparently didn't have a doctor at the time I was born. And so my mother had to drive to Enid. It's about 45 miles to give birth to me. So
got there in time.
Got there in time, yes. So I was born in St. Mary's Hospital, which is still in Enid.
What did your mother and father do for a living?
So my dad was a carpenter and farmer, and my mom was a full-time homemaker and farm wife and took care of myself and my siblings.
How many in the family?
So
where do you fall?
I had 2 older sisters and 2 younger brothers. So I'm the middle, the nicest one.
The middle child.
That's right.
A lot.
Well, I don't know about that.
What was it like? Did you go to school then in Enid the first few years?
No, I went to school in Kingfisher. I always lived in,
okay.
Yes. I actually, my older sister had cerebral palsy and was in the hospital a lot. And so my next sister and I spent a lot of time with each other, and she taught me how to read when I was about 3.5 or 4 by playing school with me. And so they suckered me into going to school by telling me there would be more books. And so I thought school would be a fabulous thing, and really thought that for decades, obviously, because I went to school for so long.
You had good experiences in Kingfisher with school.
Kingfisher really was noted at the time for having a really excellent school system, and I had a teacher or 2 that was grumpy and mean, but I felt like I got an excellent education there.
So you're in high school, and you're are you interested? What are you interested in, and how do you end up in college?
So I just read continuously, and I did think I grew up on a farm, and so I thought the point of summer was to read lots of books. And so our public library, would allow country kids to take 4 books home at a time. And so I would take my siblings with me and pick out their books too, so that I could have all the books to read in a week. And so I just read widely. So I thought I would go to college and be an English major because I thought I could read more. And so I did go to college, and I was an English and elementary ed major, which, I don't know, didn't make a great deal of sense. And I went to college undergraduate at Northwestern.
Right.
And I had a professor who gave us some kind of a personality test and called me in and said, "You need not to be an elementary teacher. You will hate it." And I said, "No, but I really love children." And he said, "Well, find something else. You won't like this career." And
That's
which
hilarious.
destroyed me. Because at the time, women got to be nurses or teachers, and I sure wasn't going to be a nurse. I didn't like that. So I was an English major too. So I decided I would major in English and psychology, which is even less sensible. But I graduated with a double major in English and psychology.
I don't know. I think it served you well. Now, you met your husband at Northwestern.
I did.
And I wonder if you could tell us how you met.
Well, I was in a library.
Right. So my question actually is more, had you already declared your double major?
Yes.
When you met?
Yes, I
Okay.
had. Yes, I had.
But you hadn't had any psychology classes with him.
Not with him, no. And learned that he was in some psychology classes. And so we then scheduled classes together, obviously. But no, it was random. I saw him in the library. He saw me. He had seen me before. He said, "Hey, aren't you Carol Nice?" Which is my maiden name. And I said, "Yes." And the librarian said, "Shh." So we went outside and visited with each other.
Thank you. That was a more detailed.
Well, he wouldn't remember.
When you left there, you went to Oklahoma State, and Joe explained to me a little bit about how he ended up there, and you're already married, correct?
We were married. We were married during both of our senior year in college, and went off to OSU. I actually was thinking that I might still get a degree in English, and had the misfortune to go home with Joe to his family's home in Grainola, which is north of Fairfax here. And on the way home was in a car wreck and broke my kneecap.
Oh my goodness.
And so I was in the hospital, and back in the day, breaking your kneecap meant a long cast, and so I really wasn't in a position to go to school.
Yes.
So I took some, back in the day, it wasn't online classes. It was, you had to take correspondence courses. And so I took English correspondence courses and thought, I don't think I want to just sit at home and work. Maybe I'll go into psychology. So I volunteered at something called the Payne County Guidance Center. They allowed me to volunteer there and started working with kids in school systems, which I thought was really great fun, and then applied to graduate school. So I applied to graduate school. At the time, women weren't really considered to be material for graduate school. And so all of the women who applied to a PhD program were put into something called a terminal master's program. And so I was allowed to get a master's degree in clinical psychology and told that I could never apply for a PhD program. So I got a terminal master's degree, went and worked in Enid, Oklahoma for a year as a psychologist, and reapplied to the PhD program. Interviewed with all the professors. We had one female professor in the psychology department, and all the male professors explained to me that it was of no value for me to apply. And I said, "Oh, but I'll hire an attorney."
Still, she persisted.
Yes. Yes. And so I didn't have to hire the attorney. They considered me and allowed me to enter the PhD program.
Oh, thank you for sharing that story. That's a great story.
Hope it doesn't happen anymore.
Right. I'd like to go back a little bit too, because I did want to ask you, because I think you shared, when I met you the first time at a presentation, you shared a little bit about meeting Joe's family.
Yes.
Can you tell us about that?
Sure. So
your first time meeting them before you're married.
Sure. So Joe's father was 6'6", and as Joe says, looked like the Indian on the nickel. He was an impressive man, huge. And Joe's mother was non-Indian. But I was raised in a time when prejudice against Indians was just an accepted norm in Oklahoma. No one questioned it. No one educated you around that being wrong. So I drive with my husband from Alva, Oklahoma to Grainola. There's about 2 towns between there and no cars. And so you kind of think you're going to the end of the world. And you get to this place which had, then, it was the good days, 30 people. And we knock on the door and we go in the house, and his parents weren't there, and they return soon. And Joe's father is this gigantic Osage man. And he thinks I'm funny. He says to Joe, "My gosh, could you only find half a woman?" Which, I think that I am hugely tall because I'm the tallest person in my family. And I was just stunned. And then he said, "What do you know about Osages?" And I said, Joe is cute. And he dies of laughter. And he says, I like you. You're stupid. Well, I hadn't liked to think I was stupid in my life up until then, but he was huge, and so I laughed. And he laughed. And it turns out that the reason he was so glad I didn't know about Osages relates to the murders of Osages by people who married them to murder them for their money.
Right.
And so I was stunned at the thought of, I really did think Joe was cute, and I really couldn't imagine marrying him to murder him. And over the course of time, Joe's father told me many stories about the Osage Murders and the people who married them to murder them or conspired to murder them.
Mm-hmm.
And because I was always a really good student, I was really shocked because I had never heard that in my Oklahoma history class, in college. And so there was always a grain of sort of gnawing doubt in your head of, is this really true? Because who would marry someone to murder them? I was really young and in love, but the stories were true. And so Joe's dad shared many of those with us.
You were going to get an education. You know, in Kingfisher, I was wondering, and they have quite a few Cheyenne Arapaho
Yes, they do.
members.
Yes, they do.
What were the attitudes when you were growing up in Kingfisher?
And so I'll tell the better story about the bad attitudes, and that is that I was in first grade, and I went to first grade, and our school had integrated with the black school that year. And I went to school, a little country kid, and there were cute kids there. And so I came home and said to my mother, I have two new friends. I have Frankie, who's my boyfriend, and I have Sharon, who's my girlfriend. And my mother said, what are their last names? Well, little kids don't know about last names. And I said, I don't know. Sharon's really cute. We all had pigtails, and she had more than any of us. And my mother said, you have to find out her last name. So I went to school and asked Sharon her last name and asked Frankie his last name. And I came home and said to my mother, it's Sharon Minfield and Frankie Buffalo Meat. And my mother said, well, you can be nice to them, but they can't be your friends. And I said, why can't they be my friends? They're the cutest kids. And she said, well, Sharon is black and Frankie is an Indian. And I said, but at church we say, red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in his sight. And she said, well, Jesus has to like them, but they can't be your friends. She said, Sharon is black. And I said, no. She's a very light brown. And my mother said, well, Frankie is an Indian. And I said, he didn't say he was. And so I was in trouble at a very young age for befriending people who my really Christian parents did not perceive as being someone that I should befriend.
Were they, what was the attitude when you and Joe got married?
So my father said that I should not marry an Indian and told me this the night before our wedding and said that he wasn't coming to the wedding. And I said, well, gee, you're invited. And we had a church wedding planned. And I decided, my sister said, well, maybe you could get an uncle to walk you down the aisle. And I said, I will walk myself. I have made this decision. And so at the last minute, my father did show up and I drug him down the aisle. And he said, what's your hurry? You have to spend the rest of your life with him. After probably 10 years, my father decided that Joe was the kindest, smartest, best man he had ever met, because Joe is really kind, smart, and a good man. And given that my father had prejudices, for him to turn that around and to understand was really good. I loved my father, but I did not appreciate his prejudices.
Well, I'm so glad for all of you, and you are a very strong woman.
Oh, well, there have been other terms that have been used.
As you proved with the OSU psychology department. So when you are able to get into the doctoral program, what are your interests?
So I really thought that what I would like to do is to work in small rural communities. Most of the people who were getting doctorates in psychology, even then, thought that they would like to go into private practice. Well, I was not raised with wealth. I was raised in a small rural community. I had this sister with cerebral palsy. I had visited her many times in the hospital. And so I really felt for people who didn't have so much. And so I wanted to work in rural communities, which was not something that most of the faculty thought was a good idea. So after my master's degree, I worked in Enid at a guidance center and really enjoyed that. The people seemed normal to me. Even if they had problems, they seemed like people I could understand. And so it was always my goal to work in rural communities. Before I was finished with my degree, Joe had completed his and had gone to work at the Pawnee Indian Hospital. And so I thought, well, that's nearby. I'll go do some of my training there. I couldn't. I wasn't allowed to. The only psychologist working in Indian country in Oklahoma was my husband, and he couldn't supervise me. And so I was not allowed to get any of my training among Indian people, which I thought was weird. Mm-hmm. So I determined that when I was allowed to go on internship, that I would attempt to go places where I could get some training with American Indians, because I assumed Joe would probably be having a career in Indian country. It wouldn't hurt me to have that experience. And so I only applied for internships in places that there were a large number of Native Americans, and wound up going to the Seattle VA. And veterans hospitals at the time would allow you to do a special rotation with any population that they didn't have a lot of. And so I did some of my training at the Seattle Indian Center, and finally found someone to supervise me who wasn't my husband.
And it's totally different Native cultures, because you've learned quite a bit at this point, and now you're...
It was very different Native cultures, very different. And I love to learn. And so finding how different that was and learning about the different cultures, I thoroughly enjoyed. I was just delighted with that experience. In Seattle, we got not only Puget Sound tribal members, but because there was no mental health basically in much of the Northwest, we would get people from Montana shipped into Seattle to be hospitalized, and then we would go do mental health services with them while they were in the hospital. Well, they were more like Oklahoma Indians, but still different. We also had Alaska Indians shipped in for the very same purposes. There was no place to hospitalize them. So I got this broad experience with people from the coast of America to the plains, to Alaska. And I thought it was fascinating. I enjoyed learning about that.
What was your biggest contribution there, do you think?
Oh, my goodness. I never thought about that. I think probably I brought something to Seattle that they hadn't seen, and that is that I'm outrageously outgoing and really like people, and that's not kind of a Seattle style. And so a few times I got in trouble for laughing too much, and a few times I was called in by the woman who I worked for saying, "How can you be so optimistic when you're dealing with people who are depressed?" And I would say, "Dang, if I'm not optimistic, how the heck can I help them?" But I think I brought just a different style than most of the people. I wasn't then, nor do I now perceive myself as being cool. I'm kind of a warm, outgoing person, and I think that's probably what I brought.
And you had managed so far, since your marriage pretty much, you weren't either one of you having to work at some kind of, a job that was really outside of your interest, because you were in school and you were timing your job so that each one could support the other.
Right. Up till then, yes.
Up till then. Okay, yes. Some finding short separations. So, how long were you there, and then what was your next move?
So we were in Seattle at that time just for a year while I did my internship, and I had not yet completed my dissertation and had figured out that I was going to have a heck of a time commuting back and forth from Seattle to OSU to finish it, just money-wise. And so Joe was offered a job at the Hastings Indian Hospital in Tahlequah, and I got a job setting up a master's program in counseling psychology at Northeastern. Mm-hmm. And so I started the master's in counseling program at Northeastern and completed my dissertation during that year.
What was your dissertation on?
So this is really funny. So because I had a master's degree that was a clinical master's, I was required to do a master's equivalency, which was not published. And I did my master's equivalency on reading a book on toilet training your child in a day, and seeing if reading a book was enough to get people to be able to do that. And what I learned was 90% of the people who just read a book do not follow every instruction. And so you have to also have a group that gets them to read the book and discuss it and practice it, and then they can all 100% toilet train their child in a day. So that was my master's thesis, because I've always been interested in reading. So my doctoral thesis, I found a book on, and this was shocking in the day, women asking men for dates. Women didn't ask men for dates. And so this was a book on how to ask men for dates. Well, we were kind of on the cusp of being almost to thinking women could almost be liberated enough to ask a man for a date. So my dissertation was on getting women to ask men for dates. The results did not turn out, and it was because of one girl who just asked every man for a date no matter what. She was as extroverted as I probably am, and so she kind of messed up the results, but I got the dissertation done anyway.
That's a funny story.
It is.
So really, and Joe and I, Joe established, reaffirmed that there weren't any areas, there weren't any textbooks. There wasn't discussion of Native mental health issues.
Oh,
that
heavens,
didn't come
no.
till much later.
No.
So you're just kind of learning this through experience, through work. You're learning what some of the issues are. And
really, I read a great deal. If I had a client who was this tribe, I would go, when we were in Seattle, I'd go to the Seattle Public Library and find a book on that tribe and try to read about that. I would do that in Oklahoma. And I had the great good fortune of having my husband, who was Native American. And so we would attend tribal functions. I don't know we would be invited to things. I would learn things. So when we lived in Tahlequah, we were invited to a hog fry, which I'd never heard of, but we went to that. We tried to learn by being in the culture, by reading, and by discussing things with each other.
Right.
So that a lot of what would happen then and later on would be, we might get a call from someone saying, we have this Native American, and we're going to refer them to you because you have to know all about Native Americans, essentially. Well, I don't know every tribe still, and I don't know, but we did develop some personal norms around what is not normal in Indian country and what is normal in Indian country that probably some other people didn't know. Mm-hmm. And so doesn't mean we were expert on everything, but we were able, particularly because we could process it with each other, to learn from each other and from our clients.
Right. But you're still both working institutionally.
Right.
You make the move to Santa Fe because, as I understand it, Joe had the job.
So we moved actually from Tahlequah back to Seattle.
Oh, that's
and
right.
lived there for a while.
Yeah.
The reason we moved from Tahlequah is one of the reasons is that I had set up a master's in counseling program, and the head of the psychology department said to me at the end of the year, they hadn't been able to find me an office. I worked from my home. And at the end of the year, he said, Carol, we have such good news. We've been able to find a man who can teach this program. And better than that, he's an ex-football coach. And so we aren't going to be needing you next year. And so I was looking for a job.
Oh, my goodness.
And so Joe got a job at the Indian Health Service in Seattle. And I had worked with a girl at the Seattle VA who was Puyallup tribal member. And she called me and said, oh, they had a job at the Puyallup tribe. And I applied there and became the director of mental health for that tribe.
So there you're in a supervisory position.
Yes.
And what were some of the challenges?
Oh my goodness. So that was an odd job and odd history that someone should someday write. So that my first challenge was learning to budget, because I had not, they don't teach you to budget in psychology graduate school. And so we had a National Institute of Mental Health grant, and that was our funding source. And so I had to go visit with this woman about our budget. And so she says to me, Carol, you have to do this budget, and I want you to find the mental health van. And I said, we don't have a mental health van. And she said, well, you have a mental health driver, Daisy, and so you have to have a mental health van. Okay, so I had about 10 staff, and Daisy was this delightful Puyallup woman who was of the Shaker Indian faith, which I'd never heard of. It's not white Shakers. Mm-hmm. And so I go to the office and I say, Daisy, I'm told that we have a mental health van. And she said, oh, don't ever ask about that. And I said, well, Daisy, she had this terrible beater car of her own that she drove, and we didn't reimburse her mileage and I said, Daisy, if we have a van, you should be driving that. And she said, oh, Carol, have you ever seen our van? No. Well, the Puyallup tribe had taken over an old TB hospital back in the day when there were movie stars who were helping Indians get their land back. We'd had Jane Fonda and, I've forgotten his name, another movie star who helped the Puyallups get this square mile of land back in Tacoma, Washington. That was a TB hospital. So our mental health building was a little old, low building. And up on the hill was the big old TB hospital. And so Daisy says to me, have you ever seen the white Corvette up on the hill? I said, well, yeah, a couple of times. She said, that's our mental health van. I said, Daisy. And she said, Carol, don't ask about it. Well, okay, I'm an inquisitive person. And when Joe and I had moved into a house in Tacoma, we'd already had an odd experience, which was I baked bread. I still bake bread almost every day. And I had pickle jars full of flour. We'd rented this house, and the landlord helped us move in. And Joe had loaded the trailer. He just threw these pickle bottles of flour in the trailer. And so this man is helping us unload. And he says to Joe, and so what is this? And Joe said, it's flour. My wife bakes bread all the time. And he said, oh, interesting. So he helps us unload, and he comes in and visits with us, and he asked 50,000 questions. And so Joe said, you've asked a lot of questions. I have one. What do you do? And he said, I'm an FBI agent. Okay. And he says to me, do you know Chief Satiacum? And I said, no, I just took this job. I don't know the chief. And he said, do you know Assistant Chief Silas? I said, no. And he said, well, I just wondered why you took this job. And I said, well, because I worked with a girl that, is Puyallup tribal member. And he said, oh, okay. So during my 1-year tenure at the Puyallup tribe, the FBI was investigating the chief and the assistant chief and the guy who had been the director of mental health before me with the white Corvette. And they were eventually indicted on 100 counts of drug running, of gun running, of attempted murder. And so I would periodically get a client who would come in to me and say, do you know there are bodies buried under the house next door? Well, I'm a trained psychologist, right? There are paranoid people who have beliefs like that. Or it could be true. And so it wasn't true that there were bodies buried, but it was very true that there was lots of criminal activity in that tribe at the chief and assistant chief level, and this guy they'd hired to run mental health who had our van. So during the course of my year there, our landlord would call me and say, Carol, are you all right? And I would say, yes, I'm fine. I hear gunshots in the woods behind our mental health building, but I'm all right. And he would say, well, you might mention to people that your landlord called. And so I would go to work, and the people that worked with me, who knew I was green and from Oklahoma and didn't know, I would say, my landlord called me last night, and he's the FBI agent. Well, I think it helped protect me, frankly.
I'm sure it did. And
so that's the
reason that was just a year.
That's right. That's right. I went back to the Seattle Indian Health Board. I started contracting with the Quinault tribe and other tribes around the area. So I still worked with tribes, but not so much the Puyallups, who are now wildly successful, by the way, and do very well.
Thank you for
it was I learned a lot.
So as you're consulting, you're kind of picking up some of the consulting skills eventually that you'll use in your own business.
Absolutely.
But at some point then you moved from Seattle to Santa Fe.
Yes.
Because Joe has a job with Indian Health Services, I remember.
Right.
And what are you doing in Santa Fe?
And so we moved to Santa Fe. This is, the tale of woe of being a woman, okay? Except I'm still cheerful. So I was also offered a position in New Mexico. And we were both going to be working for Indian Health Service, but I would be working in Albuquerque and Joe would be working in Santa Fe. Mm. And we got to Albuquerque and I was told, oh, lucky thing, we've been able to find a man. And so I said, well, I'm going to hire a lawyer. This isn't right. I've moved. And so they offered me contract positions, not a full-time job. Mm-hmm. And so I contracted to provide services at Zia Pueblo and San Felipe and Santa Ana, a lot of the pueblos in the southern part of the Pueblo area. And so I drove to those tribes and provided contract mental health services, which was wonderful work. I loved working with Pueblos. They were delightful people. I really enjoyed that work.
What did you especially enjoy about it?
So I got to learn. So the Zia Pueblo is still a pretty conservative and traditional Pueblo. And so I show up, clearly not one of the Pueblo tribal members. And so I had to see patients in a little clinic that was a medical clinic. And so this is so weird, but around the wall were the stages of pregnancy in plastic, 3D. My patients never complained, but it kind of freaked me out. So I would be in this little room and it's me and the medical doctor didn't come on the same day I came because there was only that room and a receptionist out front. And so I'm there and I'm letting people know I'm there. I've visited with the other professionals. I went to the tribal school, but I'm not really seeing very many people. And so one day the receptionist says, Carol, Juan is here to see you. Oh, okay. So this elderly man comes in and starts interrogating me. Are you married? Yes. Are you happily married? Well, yeah. How long have you been married? I said, usually I get to ask the questions. And he said, I just need the answers. And I said, okay, well, he said, is your husband, and I can't remember the Pueblo word for being white, but he essentially asked me it. And I said, no, my husband is Osage Indian. And he said, and you're happily married? Yes. So he leaves, and the receptionist comes in, and she said, how did that go? And I said, well, fine. You don't reveal what happens. And she said, well, if he liked you, you'll see some more patients. I said, well, what in the heck? I mean, well, he was the cacique of the Pueblo. He was the spiritual leader, and he was checking me out. And his big concern, which he voiced to me more than once, was that I wouldn't marry any of their boys because he didn't want white people coming in and marrying their boys. And so he would periodically come to see me, which meant to the people in the Pueblo that I was okay.
Right.
The cacique has come in, she's okay. And then I had so many patients that I kind of wish the cacique didn't like me. But I found that fascinating. I had no concept of how that worked. The other piece that was interesting was that I would drive from Albuquerque. It was almost an hour drive, and the gate to the Pueblo was closed. And I just had to go home because the cacique and the men of the village had decided that something wasn't right in the village, and they needed to go in the kiva and dance and pray until things were all right. And you could drive back the next day and it would still be closed. And there was no communication about that. So I found that interesting and a couple of times pretty frustrating. If I had a suicidal teenager, no way to get in touch with them, that was always kind of frightening to me. Never had a problem with it long term, but it was very interesting to learn how that worked.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that.
I've had an interesting career.
So, why did you both end up leaving Santa Fe?
Really, it was related to my dad, and Joe's dad died within a few weeks of each other. And it was a hard time, and Joe's mother was alone, and my mother was alone with my sister who was disabled. And so we thought it would be best if we moved back, and, we'd forgotten how rural Oklahoma is, and that there weren't probably a lot of places with jobs for 2 PhD psychologists. I don't know, it's escaped my notice. So we moved back and quickly decided that we'd have to come up with a new plan for employment, like starting our own business.
But by then, you just have some great experiences and expertise between the two of you.
We did. Together, we had seen people from so many tribes and so much of the country that is Indian country. I mean, there's a lot of the rest of the world that we didn't really have experience in, but there's not really a lot of Indian tribes east of Mississippi. So that had worked out.
So Joe talked a little bit about the Gates scholarship project, and also about the Wilma Mankiller work. I'm wondering if you can talk about one or two other projects that you think were that your as consultants, having started your consultancy.
So one of the first things that we did some work for the Sac and Fox tribe on a grant through, it was called then the Office of Substance Abuse Prevention. We'd had an awakening in this country that there might be a drug problem. And so the federal government created a new agency to deal with that and gave grants to many tribes. And so we were working on this substance abuse treatment and prevention project. And I was asked if I could come to DC and consult with other tribes. And eventually I was the consultant for all of the rural and Native American grants in the country. And so I got to fly around the country and see even other tribes that I hadn't seen and consult with them about their projects. I loved that work. I thought that was really interesting. I probably worked with 100 tribes during that time. So I would fly someplace in the middle of nowhere that no one else would go and that I thought was fascinating, and get to see some tribal program, give people ideas about things that might work, help them with any problems they had. So I did that for probably 10 years off and on. Oh, so I really enjoyed that work. That was fun.
And it brought to mind another question, and now I've...
Oh, that happens to me too.
I mean, you're doing this amazing consulting work, and it's I guess the question I wanted to set the time frame, because are we talking mid-80s then?
Oh, so that would have been early 90s.
Early 90s, okay.
Like very late 80s, I think, is when that agency started. So very late 80s through the 90s is most of when we did that. But we did it off and on. We did some of that consulting up through about 5 or 6 years ago.
Right.
So, and
a lot of periods when you're apart, you're traveling.
Right. And you know, I'm not a very shy person, so it didn't bother me a great deal. And Joe and I have been, I don't know, he's a trustworthy person. It worked out well. We had a few times that we strangely met in airports.
Oh, it's not right.
Well, Joe would be flying one way and I was flying another way. And I think it was one of my birthdays. We met in the Wichita airport and had my birthday dinner. Yes. But a lot of that travel was really to very remote places like Ethity, Wyoming, which is little teensy tiny. And honestly, that agency, periodically, they would ask other consultants to go to some of these places, and they just wouldn't go. And I thought, okay, Ethity looks just like Grainola. There's nothing there. But other people would be somewhat frightened by that. And Ethity, I loved the people there. And so I was flying in on a small plane, and the weather had gotten kind of bad, and we're being late, and the airport is tiny. I think it was in Riverton was the airport. And there was a nice farm woman sitting next to me, and she asked what I was doing. And I said, I'm flying in. I'm going to do this consulting with this prevention project for the tribe. And she said, do you know the people that are meeting you? And I said, no, but, you know, it'll be fine. And she said, you don't even know them? And I said, well, it'll be fine. I'm sure they're nice people. And she said, well, listen, if we get to the airport and they look frightening to you, you can just come home with me. And so the funniest thing is we get to this airport, which is the size of, I don't know, a Chili's restaurant. It's tiny. And we were late, and there was a man there waiting to greet his friend, you know, an old joke. He has on a gorilla costume. And so I say to the woman, well, it's not him, so I think I'm good. The guy who was meeting me was Cheyenne guy named Gary Goggles. And Gary Goggles was a Vietnam vet and usually wore black and had a black hat and a big feather. And this woman's eyes are like, he'll be fine. Gary became a really good friend.
That's a great story. So what's something that you are working on now that you especially are enthusiastic about? Because Joe mentioned you have several projects going.
So for the research part of our business, I'm just so delighted that we get to resurvey Osage tribal members. We got to do that 10 years ago. Okay. We get to do it again. We get to compare health status. We get to see how that is going. And whenever we get to do that, I am so thrilled, because for some tribes, we do some research, we make recommendations, they take the recommendations, and we get to see if that works. Mm-hmm. And that's thrilling when it does. It's almost equally interesting to do it twice when nobody took the recommendations and to say, see, dang it. We don't say it quite that way, but see, we probably still need to work on that. Mm-hmm. And so we've done that with several tribes where we get to do the same thing a couple of times. When we first started and we worked for Wilma Mankiller, she was a genius of a woman. Mm-hmm. And so that made us think we were geniuses too, because she would assign us work to do. We would do this work. We would give her recommendations. And Wilma would say to her staff, do that. They would do that. And it turned out. So we thought, well, dang, we're golden. I mean, when we do that.
That's going to work every place.
You know what? It doesn't. Wilma Mankiller was one of a kind. Not that every other tribe doesn't have good leaders, but really people who grasp that if you have a serious health problem, if obesity is overtaking your tribe, you'd better start working on it because it's not going to go away on its own. If diabetes is at epidemic proportions, start working on it. Even if you start, you're not going to fix the whole problem. And so a part of what I like is when we get to repeat those things and when I get to see that it had an effect. That just like doing counseling, I don't think I said this, but doing counseling in Indian country is very different from doing it in the white world for this reason. I get to see the people again. In Indian country, there's still community. And so whatever tribal group, and there are different ways it works, but whatever tribal group it is, I will see my patients again. And I will be able to see if they've gotten better. I will be able to see if they didn't as well. But I get feedback. And you get that doing research in Indian country. You get to do these things. People implement something. It works. And you feel like, yes, yes. And so I'm thrilled to get to do that again for the Osages. On the Fairfax Chief, the newspaper side, which is a whole different world, yes. The interesting thing to me is when we took over the newspaper 3 years ago, the murders of Osages were never mentioned in this town or in this newspaper. And so I started writing some stories about history, and then we had The Killers of the Flower Moon come out, and I've been able to write stories about the reality of what happened here. And to me, it's a form of community psychology to say, we're not going to deny anymore. Mm-hmm. And we are going to continue to address this. I have some resistance. I have people who don't like this. Mm-hmm. But to me, our community is never going to heal itself without saying, this happened here. This happened, dang it. Right. It's awful. It's a horrible history, and we have to accept that it happened. And to me, while you do it with writing as opposed to with counseling, right, you are addressing community issues in a way I would have never conceived if I didn't fall into having to run the newspaper. But I'm really grateful for the opportunity to get to do that. So
you were kind of laying the groundwork, and I've seen a couple issues of the paper, including the special edition, which was
yes,
Killers of the Flower Moon. But you were sort of laying the groundwork with these little historical columns that you were writing, and then this One Book, One Community becomes an opportunity to really...
That's right. And so to me, this is just of great importance to the community. And while you were interviewing Joe, 3 little boys came to the door and they said, what's going on? Why can't we come in? I said, well, we need to be quiet. What are they doing? Well, they're interviewing Joe. Why are they interviewing Joe? Well, they're talking about the book, Killers of the Flower Moon. Oh, I know what that is. That is so gratifying to me. They're, 10, 11, and 13. And so would they have known about this history? Would there have been any opportunity? And it just, to me, it's like, I don't know, I did my research on getting people to read books in the first place. And so it's of such great importance to me that we write down what's real, we read what's real, and I'm hopeful that someday I can have a group that will discuss this. Hadn't happened in Fairfax yet.
Okay.
Hasn't happened in Fairfax yet.
Right.
But at some point, I'm hopeful that we can have a discussion group about this. I've visited with some ministers about doing that, and they're still reluctant, interestingly enough. But I think at some point, when we get to the point when we can say, these horrible things happen, it wasn't anyone still living, but it is the parents of some people still living. It's certainly the grandparents of some people still living. It's ugly. I wouldn't want to have to accept that about my parent or grandparent, but you do have to accept the ugliness of your parent or grandparent. My father was biased against Native Americans. I don't love that about him, but I did love my father. And I think that's where we all have to get to, is that none of us are perfect, but if we can at least say what our flaws are and start to accept ourselves as the flawed human beings we all are, then I think it will be a better world and better community.
Right. Well, I'm glad you're working towards that. And I think the other thing I really love about the paper is, I guess, all of your English background.
Finally, yes.
It's fun to read.
Nice.
It seems very balanced and yet very inclusive.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. It's the oddest thing to me that I never expected to write like this. And I think I'm still a better reader than I am writer. I'm a way better reader than I am writer. And once I get the paper out and open it and see my mistakes, I'm just an excellent reader. But at the time, I don't always see it.
So what are some other ways that you've gotten involved in the community? And the newspaper just kind of threw you into the midst of that, didn't it? Yeah. Because you were living outside of...
Yeah. So living here, we also are in charge of the Fairfax Community Foundation. And so I have this...
Can you explain how that happened?
Oh, goodness. I just walk into the weirdest things. That's just my life. And so this lady called and said, Carol, would you be interested in seeing the Tall Chief Theater? And I said, I'd love to see the Tall Chief. I've never seen it. And she said, well, come down and I'll give you a tour. So Joe and I go down and she opens it up and gives us a tour. About maybe 15 years ago, a group of citizens had worked on it and then quit. And so she shows us the theater, which is, I call it bland on the outside and grand on the inside. It is the most bland exterior, but inside it opens up to a 4-story auditorium that's amazing with curved stair steps. I mean, it's gorgeous. And I'm just blown away. And she said, would you like to be on our board for this? And I said, well, sure, we'll do that. And she said, well, we have to go over to the bank and sign a few papers. Okay. So we go to the bank and we're signing the papers. And she said, you know what? I don't really want to do this anymore. Why don't you guys just take over? And so she resigned from the board and Joe and I were there.
The board.
The board. And so there are 2 small spaces in the theater. One had originally been the concession stand, which was open to the outside, and one, a tinier one, was the police station. And so we decided that we would try to get money to get one of those rooms fixed. And the room is very small, but the Osage casinos gave us a very small grant, and we finished that room off. And so we've held art markets there. We will bring in, it's so tiny. The most we can bring in is 3 artists. We'll have tiny little tables, and it's not big enough for what we do. But we've had several art markets. We bring mostly Native artists in. They show their work. We've had other events with that. We had David Grann, the author of Killers of the Flower Moon, there for a book signing. We most recently got an Osage sculptor to complete a chainsaw sculpture of Maria Tallchief, who is from our town. So we've tried to get some interest and excitement about the Tallchief. We get interest and excitement. So far, we haven't gotten money.
I'm hoping that will come.
I'm hoping so too. But that's been very rewarding to me.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about the history of the theater.
So not as much as known as should be. It was built by Alex Tallchief, who is Maria Tallchief's father. And so Alex Tallchief would have been one of the Osages who would have gotten oil money in the 1920s. And I am assuming that he was a relatively well-off man. It's an assumption. The house we're living in right now, the street to the north of us, begins the Tallchief addition. And so this part of town, I am assuming, was part of his land from the Osages. And so he had this land. He built a mansion up on the hill for his wife and daughters. He built the Tallchief Theater. Very quickly, it was turned over to a management group and run mostly by managers. And I have been unable so far to track down when ownership changed. Mm-hmm. So it was run as a theater when he opened it. Initially, it was built in 1928, and so it was built for both movies and vaudeville. So there are dressing rooms under the stage where the vaudevillian actors could go change their costumes and come up and do their thing. And there was something called a photo player, which was the sound effect pipe organ for vaudeville and silent movies. And no one, I have documentation that there was a photo player, but no one knows what happened to that machine or to the pipe organ. But someone brought me in the music. And so it's like, play right here the sound of horses, and play right here this. And so the machine would make all of these sounds, and it must have been, up to the date and the latest thing when they got it. And so an elderly man, he's in his 90s, has redone theaters all over Oklahoma, and he came to look at the Tallchief. Okay. And he says, for the size of town this is a huge theater. It's about twice the size of a theater in Pawnee and far grander in scope, a grand high ceiling, the balcony area. He says this is indicative of the wealth that must have gone into building that, because that would have been so atypical of the time. Pawhuska, which is a town twice our size, has the Constantine Theater, which they have restored, and it is not bigger than our theater. It is grander, but that's because ours has been gutted. And I have one picture of the interior, which is so dark and dull that you can't tell what it was. And so really don't know what the interior really would have looked like, but a stunning building. There were 4 offices above what are the concession stand. And so some of those doors still say manager, which I find absolutely charming.
So you mentioned there was an office that said manager.
Yes. And so one of my favorite stories, the woman who turned the theater over to us had been a ticket taker at the Tallchief. And so you would walk in and buy your ticket. And she said at the end of the day, you had to walk outside and up some exterior stair, well, they're interior, to the manager's office and give the manager the money. And she said never did she give him more than $200. And that seems incredible, because people tell me that it was 10 cents to see the movie when it opened, yes. 25 cents later. So $200 would have been...
And there were a lot of seats.
Yes. The theater seats 800 people, or would if the seats were still there, which is half of the population of our town currently. So It's a huge... It's a wonderful thing to have. I hope we can get it restored, and hope that we can get people interested enough to get involved in community theater or bringing productions here, but It's not there yet.
Yes, well, considering the amazing work that you two have done, I think it's probably going to happen.
Well,
confident that it will.
Yeah, hope so.
So having worked, and of course you've been working in this area too of tribal mental health, so it's a little bit different. But I'm thinking back to your experiences with the psychology program and how you feel maybe the field has changed for women, and also the situation for Native women in psychology at the moment, maybe both those things.
So, yay, it's changed. No. So, there are now more female psychologists than male.
I did not know that.
Which is shocking, absolutely shocking, because there was really obvious discrimination against women, just obvious. The program that we helped start when we were graduate students at OSU, so if you didn't get this from what I've said, I was a little bit of a hellraiser. And so Joe and I and an African American woman started something called the Diversified Students Committee at OSU in the psych department, which eventually became a program that now helps train Native American psychologists. And there's that program at OSU, at the University of North Dakota, and in Montana. And so those programs work very hard to train Native psychologists.
I believe it's called American Indians into Psychology.
Yes, at OSU, yes. I would say that still Native American women psychologists face some incredible challenges. So do women psychologists in general. But I think that from my perception of working with these programs, it's harder on Native American women. And a part of that is the cultural piece. And so I would say in Montana, the head of that program is a Native American woman psychologist herself. And that makes an incredible difference about how the understanding happens of dealing with those cultural things. Maybe not so much at OSU. And probably a need to have a Native American woman psychologist there as well, because women face the challenge of raising children, taking care of elders, if you're whatever you are. But if you are also in a Native American tribe where honoring your elders is important, where cultural events are important, you don't just opt out. Mm-hmm. And so helping those women find ways to meet the incredible demands that society places on women is something that I think is still a challenge for OSU. And I personally wish they would work a little harder at that challenge. I think it's better. When Joe and I were graduate students, there were at least 2 or 3 Native American women who essentially dropped out within a year or 2 of being accepted into the program. Mm-hmm. And in retrospect, I think a little support might have helped. Mm-hmm. They faced incredible challenges, and some kind of acknowledgement of how their culture might affect things would have been immensely helpful. That didn't exist at the time. Mm-hmm. It does now exist, but then you have to implement it. Then you have to say, okay, here are the ways in which we're going to accommodate our students who come from someplace different from a white male guy who wants to go into private practice. Mm-hmm. So OSU has graduated some Native American PhD psychologists, to their credit, but I think they could support them more. And
Dr. Ashley Koser, I don't know if
I do know Ashley. I knew Ashley Koser's mama worked for us at Sack and Fox. And I knew Dr. Ashley Koser when she was a little baby, this tall, with a little pink bow in her head. Yes, I know Ashley. She's a sweetheart.
That must be gratifying for you to see that kind of thing happening.
It is. It is.
Well, is there anything else we should talk about before we wrap up?
Well, I probably could talk more, as you can tell, but this has been charming. I appreciate you asking me the questions.
Thank you so much for your time, Carol, and good luck on all your endeavors.
Thank you.
I'm excited for the community as well as you too.
Thank you.